Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. This one is episode 228, and the show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/228. And I hope that you guys will appreciate the title for this episode because, yes, as the Justin Raimondo Fellow at the Libertarian Institute, I am channeling my inner Justin Raimondo here to talk about Josh Rogin, who is one of the maybe biggest neoconservative proteges, a younger guy, relatively speaking, younger guy who is beating the war drums as hard as he can and doing what neocons do. And so, those of you watching the video version of the podcast will see famous classic Justin Raimondo column, BB Netanyahu ingrate. And so I am channeling, like I said, channeling that energy today. So what I'm going to be doing as well is comparing Josh Rogin's recent column, "The Skeptics Are Wrong. The U.S. Can Confront Both China and Russia," in the Washington Post, an article he just came out with on August 4th, a few days ago. 2 weeks ago now. And I'm going to be kind of comparing it with my article, Uncle Sam's Grand Delusion, which is where I addressed this topic exactly back in April. And I think that'll be useful. So who is Josh Rogin? Well, Josh Rogin is a columnist at the Washington Post. Let's go through and try and find, he had an actual article here. Josh Rogin, here is his bio in Foreign Policy. Josh Rogin covers national security and foreign policy and writes the daily web column, The Cable. His column appears bi-weekly in the print edition of the Washington Post. He can be reached for comments or tips at whatever. Previously, Josh covered defense and foreign policy as a staff writer for Congressional Quarterly, writing extensively on Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo Bay, U.S.-Asia relations, defense budgeting and appropriations, and the defense lobbying and contracting industries. Prior to that, he covered military modernization, cyber warfare, space, and missile defense for Federal Computer Week magazine. He has also served as Pentagon staff reporter for Asahi Shimbun, Japan's leading daily newspaper in its Washington, D.C. bureau, where he reported on U.S.-Japan relations, Chinese military modernization, the North Korean nuclear crisis, and more. I thought my bio was long and boring. A graduate of George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, Josh lived in Yokohama, Japan, and studied at Tokyo Sophia University. He speaks conversational Japanese and has reported from the region. He has also worked at the House International Relations Committee, the Embassy of Japan, and the Brookings Institution. Josh's reporting has been featured on CNN, MSNBC, C-SPAN, CBS, ABC, NPR, WTOP, and several other outlets. All cathedral outlets. He was a 2008-2009 National Press Foundation's Paul Miller Washington Reporting Fellow, 2009 Military Reporting Fellow with the Knight Center for Specialized Journalism, and the 2011 recipient of the Interaction Award for Excellence in International Reporting. He hails from Philadelphia and lives in Washington, D.C. Okay. So, Josh Rogin, I also have an article here that was linked by Caitlin Johnstone in a piece that she wrote about him. You can see his picture here. He's giving a talk at the Hudson Institute, which we've covered before in the podcast as being a neoconservative think tank, and the Foreign Policy Initiative, another neoconservative think tank started by Bill Kristol and Robert Kagan. If you watch A Very Heavy Agenda, Robbie Martin's documentary, he talks a lot about the Foreign Policy Initiative and their role in escalating the Ukraine crisis and instigating and fomenting exactly the situation that we have now. Remember, Victoria Nuland is Robert Kagan's wife, and she was heavily involved in the 2014 Maidan revolution from the U.S. side. Now, this article here from Militarist Monitor actually mostly focuses on hawkish positions that Josh Rogin has taken in regards to Iran and fighting against Steve Mnuchin, who was allegedly trying to prevent Donald Trump from banning Iran from SWIFT. And Josh Rogin wrote a column chastising and advocating against Steve Mnuchin's efforts, actually writing in support of Donald Trump and his plan to remove Iran from SWIFT. And there's just a bunch of information in here about how Ellie Lake and Josh Rogin have written and collaborated on several articles, mainly being hawkish against Iran. And in the past, and like I said, this episode is not to do an exhaustive background on Josh Rogin per se, but to talk about the article that he put out in the Washington Post and his recent stance and opinions on Taiwan and China, of course. But Caitlin Johnstone mentioned him in a 2020 article, but she really kind of went after him right here in this article where Josh Rogin did a hatchet job against Tulsi Gabbard. So the title of Caitlin Johnstone's article is "The Single Stupidest Argument in the Entire Stupid Salad of Russiagate," talking about Josh Rogin going after Tulsi Gabbard on Twitter. And I'm sure that Josh Rogin wrote an article in the Washington Post about her. But one of the funniest things is, if you go back, it's well established that the Washington Post, I've talked about this before, but the sole owner of the Washington Post is a CIA contractor. And Josh Rogin is one of their main editorial authors at the Washington Post. And he writes a column 2 times a week. And so she makes that connection and talks a bit more about how CIA press releases are reported on as being news at outlets like the Washington Post. And she has a screen capture here of top stories where the New York Times, the Washington Post, and CNN are all reporting CIA press releases, which is really interesting. So I have another article here from a Substack called The Neocon Rebrand, written by The Dissident. And I'll include a link to this, as always, in the show notes page, libertyweekly.net/228. I'll just read kind of the little background here. After the Iraq War, many liberals were becoming more skeptical of neoconservatives and their talking points. This led to a shift in propaganda where many U.S. military invasions were sold to liberals as, quote, humanitarian. For example, in 2011, the NATO war in Libya was sold under humanitarian grounds with claims that Muammar Gaddafi was going to massacre his own people. This was proven false when a UK Parliament report found that the claims that Gaddafi was going to massacre civilians were overstated by Western governments and the opposition, that Islamist extremist and violent elements of the opposition were ignored, and that Islamist, extremist, and violent elements of the opposition were ignored, that the intervention was based on economic interests and that it led to a real humanitarian crisis, changing Libya from the most successful African country to a failed state. This propaganda was used again in Syria when we were told the U.S. was supporting, quote, moderate rebels, when in reality the CIA was knowingly arming al-Qaeda-linked groups. Many of the claims of chemical attacks that the U.S. bombed Syria over were proven to be carried out by these same U.S.-backed jihadists, such as the one in Douma in 2018 when a leaked report from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons found, the OPCW, if you've heard that acronym before, found that the symptoms in victims were not consistent with those of a chlorine attack and that the gas canister was more likely planted. This propaganda led some on the left who typically oppose intervention to support it in this instance because they believed it was under humanitarian grounds. This is not to say that Assad and Gaddafi are defensible people, of course. Both are brutal dictators who committed many human rights abuses, but the neocons found a way to sell interventions against both countries in a way that would appeal to the left. This neocon rebrand continued under Trump years, with many such as Bill Kristol and David Frum becoming regulars on MSNBC and being accepted by liberal audiences. A great example of this is a headline that refers to Bill Kristol as, quote, woke Bill Kristol. I write about this to compare it to a recent neocon rebrand where many are now positioning themselves as, quote, anti-establishment populists. Within this article, I will go over the figures doing this and explain their background and how they continue to push neoconservative propaganda. Now, this really ties into what Connor Freeman and I have been talking a lot about on the show, is this turn to the right, this appeal to populism, where quote-unquote outsiders or people in the independent media who are different or outside the cathedral of the mainstream press, where they're sold as giving, this is independent. It's not influenced by the military industrial complex or influenced by party politics, the establishment party politics. And this is people that we've talked about, like Tim Pool, Joe Rogan, other individuals like Sangar and Jetty, and perhaps Josh Rogan now. And it's really sinister because people are really kind of like Connor talks about, people have decided that they don't like warmongering, they don't like neocons, and they can identify it when they're seeing it be pushed by neocons from on every single issue. So the way to solve this is to have some people who are really, really bad on one issue, like China, and really, really good on other issues. Well, really good, not really, really good, but good on other issues like, not going to war with Russia. And so they build a consensus across the board by having some people who are good on some things and bad on others and giving that mixed bag. So if we go back, Connor has talked about Cigar and Jetty, but here, Josh Rogan is a part of this article. Again, I'm reading The Dissident on Substack, an article entitled The Neocon Rebrand. So here's Josh Rogan's, and Barry Weiss is also on this list. So Josh Rogan is a journalist and foreign policy analyst who writes for the Washington Post. He's known in populist circles for mainstreaming the lab leak theory, a theory that the COVID-19 virus originated in a lab in Wuhan, China. He has appeared on Cigar and Jetty's podcast, The Realignment, on Breaking Points, and on the very popular Joe Rogan podcast. Many of the well-meaning viewers of these podcasts may see these podcasts and believe that Josh Rogan is a populist outsider who somehow snuck his way into the mainstream media. What many probably would not know is that he spends every week advocating for war with almost every official enemy country of the United States. For example, at the time of my writing this article, he has written an opinion piece arguing for more, quote, American-led internationalism, aka imperialism. Within the piece, Rogan argues, quote, the Western world has broken faith with its duty to spread democracy, freedom, and dignity based on the principles of Western Enlightenment. This sounds much more like something Dick Cheney or Donald Rumsfeld would say rather than a populist outsider. More examples of Rogan's neoconservative propaganda are a 2021 article where he calls for more sanctions and regime change in Syria, and an article where he argues Biden needs to, quote, get tough on North Korea. Rogan is far from an outsider and is just another typical Washington, D.C. insider who pushes for every single war in mainstream media outlets. And so here's another thing. I mean, whenever I talk about an individual on the podcast or write an article about them, I've done so with Lindsey Graham and Adam Kinzinger with their terrible Ukraine policies. I always like to do some searches and see where they have appeared in terms of like giving talks at think tanks and stuff like that, because I think it's important to see who they're appearing alongside and who they're rubbing elbows with and who is featuring them. And so if you look here on the screen, people watching the video version, you'll see that at YPO that Josh Rogan appeared at Georgetown University alongside Bill Kristol to give a talk at George Mason University's Scalia Law School to give a talk about, it was sponsored by the National Security Institute at George Mason University, to give a talk about basically, probably how Donald Trump is terrible. It's called Impact of Threats to Democratic Institutions and Media. So probably talking about how we need to censor things and to silence people and dissent, conspiracy theories and whatnot. Discussing the impact of attacks from politicians on the media and U.S. citizens' trust in the Fourth Estate. So more journalists talking about how important journalism is. And here is a column, again, by Justin Raimondo, written in 2016, talking about Josh Rogan. And I know that that Justin tangled with individuals on Twitter towards the end of his life on a regular basis. And I know that Justin tangled with Josh Rogan at times. I don't know if Josh responded to him, but I know that he went after Josh a few times on Twitter. So if you want to go to Justin's Twitter page and just do a tweet search of Josh Rogan and see other things that he had to say. But this was in an article from 2016. Raimondo says, or take Josh Rogan, who writes about foreign policy for the Washington Post. He's upset that Trump won't risk World War III by facing off with Putin over Ukraine. Trump must be, quote, in lockstep with Putin. Yet Rogin didn't dispute the merits of what Trump had to say, that he'd consider recognizing the Crimean referendum, only implying that Trump was some kind of Manchurian candidate. I answered him here, and he soon fled back into the nether reaches of the Twitter sphere. And I'd make the same point about him that I have made about Sargent. These people are children. They have no memory of the Cold War. They've never lived under the threat of nuclear annihilation. To them, it's all a game. So, I mean, this is how prophetic Justin Raimondo's writing is. And of course, Justin wasn't the only person that was warning about brinksmanship over Ukraine, but it was foreseeable for people who were looking, had their finger on the pulse of the situation. However, I mean, going back and reading Justin's stuff is prophetic in many other ways than just this. But how prophetic is this paragraph about nuclear brinksmanship? Because that's exactly where we are right now. And you can see, sorry, my kids are running around upstairs. This isn't my usual recording time. Usually it's at night, not during the day. But Justin went off on, or he quote tweeted Josh Rogin saying that Trump was in lockstep with Putin. And Justin says, is he wrong or doesn't that matter? And then Josh responded saying the thing about Russian propaganda is that it's meant to distract us from the fact that they invaded a sovereign country. So that's just kind of an establishment talking point. Josh responds again, Josh Rogin, Trump both denied the fact of the Russian invasion and echoed Russian propaganda as his first instinct. It's weird. Raimondo says, there is no invasion, or else Kiev wouldn't exist. Crimea has been Russian since Catherine the Great. Propaganda? Question mark? No, truth. Oh, and Justin says, what's happening in Ukraine is a civil war. East doesn't like to see elected president overthrown by force. Secession followed. Josh Rogin says, are you denying thousands of Russian special forces crossed a border and took possession of Crimea by force? Do facts matter? Justin says, fact, an election was held. Fact, they voted to merge with Russia. More legitimate than the annexation of Texas. Josh Rogin says, are you claiming those were free and fair elections? Do you care? Russian propaganda is often mixed with half-truths. Justin says, why weren't they free and fair elections? Because the U.S. didn't approve? Not surprising they voted that way. Ukraine is bankrupt. So, and Justin goes through and talks with a lot of people who I'm sure at the time didn't have a Ukrainian flag in their bio, but apparently right now they do. So, yeah, if you want to go through again Justin's Twitter history and search and see where he's tangled with these swamp creatures, it's definitely an interesting thing to do. And before I get into Josh Rogin's latest article about the skeptics are wrong, U.S. can confront both China and Russia, we do the establishment neoconservative, checklist and check all the boxes with Josh Rogin, because here's a column where he's criticizing Biden for being too soft on China because of the Uyghur genocide, which of course is something that I've covered in depth on this podcast. And it's something that neoconservatives and hawks like to bring up and just beat on incessantly. This whole theory that, the gigantic sanctions campaign against China over what's allegedly happening in Xinjiang, banning all exports from Xinjiang with a assumption that it's an assumption that all goods coming from Xinjiang were made with slave labor. So it's a rebuttable presumption that anyone importing goods from Xinjiang has to disprove and prove that they weren't made with slave labor. And of course, this article came out in June, around June 23rd, when Biden's Xinjiang sanctions went into effect. So they were signed in 21, I believe, soon after Biden took office, and they didn't come into effect until June 22. And so they come into effect, and then Josh Rogin comes out with a column saying that Biden is being too soft on China's genocide. So, and he claims it is a genocide in the title. So anyways, all right, so that's kind of a bit of a portrait on Josh Rogin here. You can kind of see who he is, what he does, kind of where he comes from, the people he associates with, the tangles that people like Caitlin Johnstone and Justin Raimondo have gone after Josh Rogin. And so, hey everybody, welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. It is at my new membership website, libertyweekly.club. And I know I've been announcing this, but I left Substack, rolled out a new membership website that operates the same way. You get content through your email address, but there's also a web page, libertyweekly.club, where you can go and read the articles. And it works really great so far. Just a couple hiccups in terms of trying to figure out how to use free previews for people who are just signed up to the free newsletter. And for people who sign up through the membership here, you can see that right now I have a $5 a month tier that will get you access to early access to episodes of Liberty Weekly, access to bonus episodes that I've been trying to come out with 2 times a month, preprint access to all my Libertarian Institute articles before they're published, and I'm working on setting up a subscribers-only live stream. I'd like to do that before the end of the month. Which I will announce through the email list. So if you go through, sign up for the email list, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button. You can choose the free tier or you could choose the $5 per month tier, which will get you access to the benefits. But for free content, there still is free content up there. Like I do a lot of article content there. So head on over to libertyweekly.club. The other thing that I'm really excited to announce is a collaboration between myself and Ludwig von Mises Pieces, which is the guy who does all my graphics and thumbnails, and the guy who, he does a ton of awesome work. So you can see Liberty Weekly merch is now available if you head on over to libertyweekly.net this time /merch, MERCH. You'll be able to find Liberty Weekly merch with my new logo with the rising sun and Lady Liberty holding the shield and flag. I really like the logo that he was able to do for me. And you can see that you can get coffee mugs there. You can get sweatshirt. You can get t-shirts and all that kind of stuff. The other collaboration. Oh, and if you use promo code LW10, that will get you 10% off. And it will also get a kickback to me and show him that you bought through my link. But you could also go through all the other merchandise that he has there. There's lots of good stuff. You buy anything in the store with promo code LW10, and I will also get a kickback. You can see a bunch of stickers and t-shirts and designs that people in our sphere of the Liberty movement will just love all that, the merch that he has there. It's original stuff that he's made himself. And we did a collaboration on a t-shirt, that idea that I had, Dissolve NATO, super timely right now. But for those of you just listening to the audio version only, it's the NATO logo that is being shattered into a million pieces, and it says Dissolve NATO on it. So I think it's a really cool, timely t-shirt. Of course, it was an idea that I'd commissioned, and I think that he did an awesome job with it. And if you like my thumbnails and logo art, Ludwig von Mises Pieces did Why I Am Anti-War podcast logo, which is a dove coming out of a helmet. And I really, really like that logo too. So check out this Dissolve NATO. You can get it in sticker format. You can get it on a sweatshirt or a t-shirt. And I'm going to be picking some of these up myself because I think they turned out really awesome. So again, head on over to libertyweekly.net /merch. And to get the NATO t-shirt, head on over to libertyweekly.net /NATO, NATO. All right, so that's all the stuff I got for you guys this week. Thanks everyone for subscribing, all the members at libertyweekly.club. Really appreciate it. You really help me afford all the hosting costs and to upgrade my equipment and all that kind of stuff too. So, all right, thanks. Peace. Here is the more recent article. So he says, again, the skeptics are wrong. The U.S. can confront both China and Russia. August 4th, 2022 article. Josh Rogin writes, this week, the United States proved it could handle China and Russia at the same time, without starting any new wars or losing any ongoing battles. This should put to rest two trendy but wrong ideas. The notion on the right that we must back off Russia to confront China, and the notion on the left that we must back off China to confront Russia. And to be fair, I have not really heard any notion from the left that we have to back off China in order to confront Russia. It's mostly the left says, well, we need to confront Russia and China. And then the right says, well, we should back off Russia and focus everything we got on China, is what I've heard. So it's a false choice, he says, because it's all one confrontation. And in that effect, you know, in the Hawks world, yes, this age of great power competition with the 2018 NDS, the National Defense Strategy that I've talked about on this podcast, pivoting from the war on terror to great power competition with Russia and China. In the Hawks' mind, yes, it is one confrontation because this is a struggle to maintain the U.S.-dominated world order. Rogin continues, Congress came together this week to assert U.S. leadership and push back against the aggression of two autocratic regimes. The Senate voted 95-1 on Wednesday to ratify the addition of Sweden and Finland to NATO, a strong rebuke of Russia's brutal and unprovoked war against Ukraine. Both parties and eventually the Biden administration also affirmed their support for House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, despite the Chinese government's attempts to bully her into abandoning the trip. Okay, so much framing here that he does. So again, we're calling the regimes of Russia and China autocratic. However, that's again the pot calling the kettle black, as I put forward in a recent episode. That was an article that I did called Pot and Kettle. The U.S. uses chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. I think I called it America's. I called it Empire of Death, America's Moral Bankruptcy, episode 218. So libertyweekly.net/218. I talked about, you know, someone advocating for U.S. interventionism has no business, you know, calling out Russia and China for being autocratic regimes, which they may be, you know, but doing it from the United States, just, what is it? There's a Bible verse about don't point out the speck in another's eye and not call out the log in your own eye. That's exactly what it is. So the Senate voted 95-1 on Wednesday to ratify the addition of Sweden and Finland to NATO. He says it's a strong rebuke of Russia's brutal and unprovoked war against Ukraine. And so this is an example of repeating a lie so often that it becomes truth. It's a tactic that the mainstream media uses. And basically to say it's brutal, it's both brutal and unprovoked war against Ukraine. Well, in brutality's sake, yes, I mean, any war is awful. I'm primarily, anti-war is the main thrust of what I come from and what I believe in. So any war is brutal. However, I mean, it does stand to say that the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine was meant to be a cut the head off the snake situation, avoiding highly populated civilian areas. And of course, U.S. efforts to assist the Ukrainians by providing them weapons and encouraging them and providing them training and intelligence is only seeking really to prolong a war that is unwinnable from the Ukrainian point of view. And the more the war is prolonged, the more casualties will be inflicted upon the Ukrainian forces and Ukrainian civilians. So it really is a lot of context that's being left out of Josh Rogin's viewpoint here and what he is pressing in this article. So he says both parties and eventually the Biden administration also affirmed their support for Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, which, let's see, what he cites this, links to this little talk by Antony Blinken, and I just want to see what it says. So we'll listen to that for the podcast.
regard to Taiwan, first, the speaker will make her own decisions about whether or not to visit Taiwan. Congress is an independent, co-equal branch of government. The decision is entirely the Speaker's. What I can say is this. This is very much precedent in the sense that previous speakers visited Taiwan. Many members of Congress go to Taiwan, including this year. And so if the Speaker does decide to visit and China tries to create some kind of crisis or otherwise escalate tensions, that would be entirely on Beijing. We are looking for them, in the event she decides to visit, to act responsibly and not to engage in any escalation going forward. We do not know what Speaker Pelosi intends to do, but again, that is entirely her decision, and one that we respect one way or the other.
So really, it's a tacit endorsement of what Nancy Pelosi is doing, and you see a lot of different. I'm working on a piece for the Libertarian Institute where I talk about the mainstream response and talking points to Nancy Pelosi's visit, and essentially the whole theme of it is that it's gaslighting, and it's gaslighting because one like a hallmark thing that gaslighters do, and for those of you who are familiar with the term gaslighting, it's become like a pop psychology term that's been widely used, but it refers to something that abusive partners do to their victims, where they try to convince their victims that they're crazy or that they're not perceiving reality as reality, that there's some kind of warped that their internal thoughts are somehow warped or inaccurate, that they can't trust themselves and their own judgment and emotion. And that's exactly what the U.S. State Department and people like Josh Rogin and Antony Blinken was doing in that sound clip, is where they say, well, there's China's overreacting. There's really nothing for them to be upset about, right? And that's because, oh, well, Nancy Pelosi isn't the first House Speaker to go to Taiwan, and there have been many delegations from Congress that have visited Taiwan, so they have no reason to be upset. And what they're doing is overreacting, and they're the aggressors, and they're the ones that are provoking and creating a crisis. When that's just not what reality is. The reality is that Newt Gingrich did go to China during the same visit that he went to Taiwan in 1997, and this was just following the third major Taiwan Strait crisis. And so in the same trip he visited China that he visited Taiwan. At the time, they were just getting over a major crisis where they had worked on a lot of these issues, and China at the time was much weaker militarily than they are now. So that occurred a long time ago, in 1997. So, and the thing about these other congressional delegations that go to Taiwan is that every time these delegations go to Taiwan, China has a response, and they are upset and furious about it. And so the way that Antony Blinken frames it in that little soundbite is that, oh, well, congressional delegations have been going to Taiwan for decades, well, since Trump mostly, but he makes it sound like it's been decades that they've been going. And oh, well, China, they never get upset when these delegations have gone before, so therefore, well, they're making a crisis out of this, and that's just not the reality of the situation. So I'm working on a piece. Keep your eyes open for that. Hopefully in the next week it'll be released. Okay, so, and of course the Chinese government's attempt to bully her into abandoning the trip. Josh Rogin really makes it seem like Nancy Pelosi's visit was universally praised, when there were a lot of officials, even the Biden administration, who was outwardly warning her not to go. And the U.S. military, the Pentagon, saying that it wasn't a good idea for her to go. So Rogin continues, despite deep skepticism of U.S. intervention abroad among the American people, leaders in both parties seem to understand that the U.S. has a duty and an interest in exerting active leadership and pushing back against America's adversaries in both Europe and Asia. Quote, we don't beat China by retreating from the rest of the world. We beat China by standing with our allies against our enemies, said Senator Ted Cruz before voting to expand NATO. Cruz was responding to arguments made by fellow Republican Josh Hawley, the only senator to vote no on NATO's expansion. In an op-ed in the National Interest, Hawley wrote, quote, "We must do less in Europe and elsewhere in order to prioritize China and Asia. So American people, you lose," basically. He said the United States must make tough choices because, quote, "we cannot defeat China and Russia in two major wars at the same time." Hawley is playing into a growing foreign policy trend on the right that seeks to justify taking the pressure off Moscow. The Conservative Political Action Conference welcomed Russia-friendly Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban to its event this week. The Heritage Foundation, once a bastion of traditionally hawkish GOP foreign policy, opposed U.S. funding for Ukraine in May, ostensibly over accountability concerns. That's really interesting, I think. And I think it's also interesting and noteworthy that Josh Rogin, that all of this, so, and maybe I may be guilty of this in my coverage too, of assuming that all hawks are the same and that all hawks are equally hawkish. And that doesn't exactly appear to be the case. It might be the case that Hawley and people like Josh Hawley and Josh Rogin, yeah, it is Josh Hawley and Josh Rogin, that they are just doing this choreographed WWF style fight here over these issues. And when behind the scenes they really agree that they want war with both Russia and China, it might be more likely that Josh Hawley is sincere in his belief that we shouldn't become more involved in Ukraine, and that we should be eminently hawkish on China. But it is interesting to see someone like Josh Rogin publicly calling Hawley out for this position. And of course, we shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that the right and left are exactly the same, even though there's a consensus on many issues. Like Josh Rogin and Josh Hawley agree on confronting China is one thing. So, but I think we should be careful that we don't fall into that intellectual trap that all hawks are equal, that all hawks want the same thing, and just be careful about that. So, but Rogin continues, but the NATO vote shows that most GOP leaders understand a softer position on Russia is neither good policy nor good politics. 6 in 10 Americans support providing weapons and aid to Ukraine, and 7 in 10 Republicans support NATO. So I'd be interested in looking into that, where he's referring to. It looks like a Fox News poll. So I don't trust that. I mean, who knows? Polls. I mean, how much do you believe polls, and what are the criteria? But moreover, who cares what the majority of people thinks? I mean, we've talked about how democracy is just three wolves and one sheep voting on what's for dinner. So contrary to what Hawley argues, strengthening NATO actually lessens America's burdens in Europe. More importantly, the idea that increasing deterrence against Russia will lead to war is a straw man. NATO is a defensive alliance destined to prevent a larger war. So the idea that increasing deterrence against Russia will lead to war is a straw man? Well, I don't think so, because that's exactly the reason why Putin invaded Ukraine, according to Putin's statement about the invasion, his casus belli. That's what he said, that the United States having closer ties to Ukraine as if they were going to bring them into NATO, and providing these dual-use rocket launchers to surrounding Eastern European countries, primarily, and the possibility of rockets being put in Ukraine that could lead to a first strike situation on Moscow, and bring that reaction time down to maybe 8 minutes is a huge problem. It's a red line for Russia that's been stated ad nauseum for decades. So I think that's funny. It's not a straw man. The idea that increasing deterrence against Russia will lead to war, it's not a straw man, because it has led to war between Russia and Ukraine. NATO is a defensive alliance destined to prevent a larger war. Well, NATO is on paper a defensive alliance, but its reason for being was eliminated in 1989 with the fall of the Soviet Union. And moreover, strengthening NATO ties doesn't it doesn't lead to strengthening NATO ties, doesn't lead right away to lessening America's burdens in Europe, because the European countries shouldering their own defense and contributing more to NATO has been a huge problem for NATO, that the United States de facto has created client states in Europe, and this has been something that have actually, even before the Ukraine crisis, has led many people to question whether NATO was even soluble, or excuse me, whether NATO was even something that was tenable. Okay, so continuing. Meanwhile, on the left, several prominent voices warned this week that Pelosi's visit to Taiwan could spark a major war with China at the worst possible time. Another straw man argument, really. Thomas L. Friedman argued in the New York Times that Pelosi's visit was, quote, reckless because Ukraine demands our full attention. Quote, it is geopolitics 101 that you don't court a two-front war with the other two superpowers at the same time, Friedman wrote. First of all, Rogin says, Friedman misapplies the reckless label. It belongs squarely on the Chinese Communist Party, which decided to threaten Pelosi's safety. China is shooting missiles in Taiwan's direction and conducting military drills all around the island. That's reckless. Visiting Taiwan for meetings is not. Okay. My brain is breaking right now. So, yes, it is true that China is shooting missiles in Taiwan's direction, actually shooting missiles over Taiwan as well, and conducting military drills all around the island, simulating a possible blockade. Well, and it may very well be reckless policy, sure, that China doing these drills, it's not something I endorse. It's aggressive, it's militarism, all that aside. Ever since Pelosi said that it was announced that Pelosi was considering or was going to go on this trip, China has been threatening that they would do this if she went. And they've been saying it the entire time. So and moreover, there are the joint communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act from 1979, where the United States has pledged that they will not recognize Taiwan as being an independent nation, that they will not have any formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan. This is against an agreement between China and the United States. The Chinese will be upset about this. I've covered this so many times in the last few episodes of the podcast. I don't want to repeat myself, but this is just an alternative version of events that Rogin is putting forward here. That, I mean, I'll leave you to decide whether or not it's who has the blame here. Is Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan against the advice of even the Biden administration and the military? China saying for decades, or having the same policy for decades, that they oppose these diplomatic envoys. Every time it happens, they increase military drills. They said that they would do something like Xi said with Biden in their meeting, that the United States shouldn't play with fire or else it will get burned, before Pelosi's visit. And Josh Rogin is here acting like the Chinese just did this because they felt like being mean, and that it's no big deal for Pelosi to have a diplomatic visit with Taiwan. This is gaslighting. More important, this analysis completely misreads the situation in China. President Xi Jinping, his impending coronation for a third term means he can't afford to look weak, but he also can't afford a major conflict right now. That might be true. To the limited extent China is withholding assistance to Russia, it is because of China's desire to avoid U.S. sanctions, and that hasn't changed. After significant hand-wringing, the Biden administration supported Pelosi's visit, using reasonable steps in diplomacy to manage the fallout with Beijing. The sky did not fall. Yes, it did. World War III did not commence. It might. Sorry, those are my editorializations. Pelosi's trip did not change the fact that China, not the United States, is the aggressive party disrupting the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. Sure. I don't know if we need to look at a map, but if we look at a map, China's an awful lot closer to Taiwan than the United States is. I don't think I need to really spell that out for everyone. And it's the United States who is abridging the status quo, moving from strategic ambiguity, saying that, well, if China invades Taiwan, we could intervene but we might not intervene. So telling Taiwan, okay, don't get too independent or talk too much about independence, and telling China, well, you better not invade or do anything militarily because we might intervene. But, at the same, it's called dual deterrence, this strategy that Gareth Porter has talked about. Discouraging Taiwan because saying, well, we might not come to your rescue, and at the same time telling China, well, we might come to the rescue. So the United States, the idea that the U.S. can choose between confronting Russian aggression or Chinese aggression is attractive until it meets reality. In truth, these two expansionist dictatorships are working together to undermine our security, prosperity, and freedom. Moscow and Beijing view their struggles against the West as intertwined, so we must acknowledge that connection as well. The good news is that the U.S. has many strong partners that also understand this is a dual threat, not a choice between two separate challenges. Leaders on both sides of the U.S. political spectrum should stop deluding the American people into the false comfort that we have the luxury to choose to confront one evil and not the other. So someone participating in gaslighting behavior, the irony and the hypocrisy of them talking about leaders on both sides of the U.S. political spectrum, deluding the American people into thinking that we could just, have peace with Russia and China and maybe help them get along. I don't think American leaders are doing that. And Josh Rogin calling them out for something they're not necessarily doing, and for something like this is just ridiculous. So I'll go over this relatively quickly because I'm running out of time and my throat hurts because I've been talking all morning, which is funny because I like to talk. So this is a piece I wrote in April of this year, Uncle Sam's Grand Delusion. So I say, I don't want to read the whole thing, cripes. On Monday, March 28th of this year, the Pentagon submitted its 2022 NDS, National Defense Strategy, to Congress. While the entire report remains classified, an unclassified fact sheet was released to the media. It identified the Pentagon's four main defense priorities. 1. Defending the homeland, pace to the growing multi-domain threat posed by the PRC, the People's Republic of China. 2. Deterring strategic attacks against the U.S., allies, and its partners. 3. Deterring aggression while being prepared to prevail in conflict when necessary. Prioritizing the Chinese challenge in the Indo-Pacific, then the Russian challenge in Europe. And 4. Building a resilient joint force and defense ecosystem. So, so the new NDS is the first since 2018 when Mattis declared great power competition like I talked about before. The 2018 NDS identified the main competitors of the United States as being Russia and China, revisionist powers Russia and China, and rogue regimes Iran and North Korea. And in its threat hierarchy, it placed Russia and China together at the top. The difference is that now it places China at the top of that threat hierarchy and has Russia below it. Although the Pentagon's new grand strategy of great power competition was declared only 4 years ago, its hubris is already apparent. The U.S. does not have the means to dominate the world, nor does it know how to do so. And I say the issuance itself of the 2022 NDS exemplifies this folly. And the reason being, and I go through in detail exactly what this is that when the 2022 NDS came out, I believe the draft was issued before Russia invaded Ukraine. And so that exigent circumstance caused the Pentagon to scramble and to rewrite their NDS that they had already prepared before the invasion to after the invasion. And I say that this is just an example of how we're ill-prepared to do this, because you have something that was being forecast. This invasion of Russia was being forecast, or the invasion by Russia of Ukraine was being forecast by the Pentagon and the intelligence community for months, even though I didn't think it would happen. But you have this foreseeable event that they think is going to happen, but it does happen, and you have the Pentagon scrambling about trying to amend their NDS and to amend their requests of Congress to deal with this unforeseen consequence, So I say here, although foreign policy, and I talk about a foreign policy the journal, the Foreign Policy, the outlet, they had a piece discussing this NDS. So I say, although Foreign Policy later argues the changes to the NDS do not significantly detract from a focus on China, the urgent modifications have raised significant concerns about Washington's ability to contain Russia and China in two main theaters. These concerns are so widely held that they have caused debate between insiders, experts, and White House and Pentagon officials. Excuse me, and this is what Foreign Affairs says. And Josh Rogin does allude to this debate in his column, talking about how critics, the skeptics are wrong. The U.S. can confront both China and Russia. So Foreign Affairs details this concern among insiders. They say the White House and Pentagon officials have insisted that they can, quote, walk and chew gum when it comes to punishing Russia's invasion of Ukraine while continuing to focus on China. But some experts and congressional officials are concerned that the ongoing crisis may limit the Pentagon's ability to come to the aid of Asian allies under China's threat. The United States already sent more than 6,000 U.S. troops to reinforce NATO's eastern flank, as well as F-35 fighter jets. Yeah, you might as well just send them, I don't know, giant boulders to carry across the field. And has had discussions about making some of those deployments permanent. The Trump-era strategy effectively abandoned the idea of a U.S. military that could fight in two major regional wars simultaneously in favor of squarely putting the U.S. focus on a possible future conflict with China. Now, that last sentence I don't think is right, and I quibble with. But anyways, some experts believe, however, that the U.S. should resist the urge to leave Europe. Quote, the temptation may be to argue that Russia's difficulties in Ukraine show that a China focus remains appropriate and that the U.S. will not need additional resources to shore up NATO in Europe. I think that is the wrong approach, said Hal Brands, a professor of global affairs at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the author of a recent book on the Cold War's lessons for great power rivalry. I say, it's like I'm repeating myself. The problem with Foreign Affairs take, I say this in my article, is that Trump never effectively abandoned the idea of a two-front war. Mattis's NDS did not reflect this claim, and neither did Trump's policy. However, Washington has been confronting China and Russia on two fronts since at least 2016. The 11th hour alterations to the 2022 NDS are a de facto continuation of the policy. And it's only driving China and Russia together in further opposition of the West. So it's almost like, in a weird opposite kind of way, I do agree with Josh Rogin that you can't pick one or the other, because your hubris and your policy of the last 20 years have driven Russia and China together. So even if you abandoned one and tried and wanted to pick on the other, you've already created this wedding between the two. So it's almost as if Josh Rogin is right in that if you're coming at it from a hawkish position where you really want the United States to take over the world or to maintain its world hegemony, you have to fight both Russia and China, because that's the bed you've made and now you have to lay into it. Or, things don't have to be this way. Or you could have a Ron Paulian foreign policy where you mind your own business, be friends with everyone, avoid entangling alliances, and trade with everyone. So, I'm trying to, here's a nice little throwaway line that I put in there. The Defense Department's submission of the 2022 NDS is reminiscent of a safety marketing pitch cobbled together the morning after an executive's DUI with the company car. Washington would demand even more money from struggling Americans to counter a war that it itself provoked and is purposely prolonging, all while it desires a pivot to the Indo-Pacific. Washington is delusional if it believes it will ever depart from a policy of dual front containment, at least as long as it pursues great power competition. And so I talk a little bit more here. I don't talk, and if I could rewrite this piece, I would have included a few more paragraphs about how ill-equipped the United States is to fight a two-front war or to confront Russia and China on two different fronts. So if, we are sending billions of dollars to Taiwan, or at least in the form of selling them tons and tons of weapons. But if we've seen the massive and really, I think, unprecedented aid to Ukraine, maybe even exceeding the Lend-Lease program during World War II, adjusted for inflation. But we've seen this massive, we have rolling support for Ukraine to the point that we're even paying their budgetary bills, where we're paying their welfare programs and things like that. And if we think that the dollar can survive hyperinflating it to the point where we're sending billions of dollars to Ukraine, more than any other country by far, and if China were to attack Taiwan or to take more hawkish stance on Taiwan, can we at the same time inflate the dollar to the point where we are sending billions and billions to Ukraine and billions to Taiwan at the same time, and then also have enough left over to hype up our military and bring it to the point where we can actually fight a major world war on both sides, or at least to the point where we're going to deter them. And in reality, the deterrence behavior is what sets off the conflict. They are sparks that light a fire. That we can afford to do that while Americans are struggling. And of course, I'm a libertarian. I'm not one for direct payments to American citizens or welfare programs to help Americans. But we could stop stabbing ourselves in the leg. We could stop doing that. And so we should stop inflating the dollar, stop antagonizing these conflicts overseas. And of course, we've talked a bit about in the show about how the U.S. military is struggling to meet its recruitment quotas, that people and young kids are finally realizing that it just isn't worth it to go into the military, and that you come out damaged in the long run. And so does this mean that we're going to institute a draft, or that there's going to be a major gigantic propaganda push to get to inspire our children to enlist in the military to fight Russia and China at the same time? And I think it really just, there's a lot to be said about the U.S. military and its inflated, how its presence is inflated, and that in fact more spending and outspending like the next two countries combined on our military budget actually doesn't produce an effective military. That and maybe I should have some people on to talk about this, but that for all this spending, does it really translate to success on the battlefield? And by spending all this money, does it create weapons that are bloated, overpriced, and you don't get as much bang for your buck? Whereas opposed to potentially China and Russia with smaller budgets to work toward and smaller objectives, can they create a more efficient fighting force? They have a smaller area to focus on than the United States. They're near abroad as opposed to us being all around the world. So there's a lot of things to talk about there, and also pushing for war with Iran at the same time. And Connor Freeman has done a lot of work on the push for war with Iran, the Israeli assassination campaign against Iran that's occurring right now, and the U.S. attempts to sabotage the renegotiations of the JCPOA. And so those are all things courting war on three different fronts. It's just insanity, and it's insane, and everyone should think it's insane and ridiculous and just laugh it off the table. But nonetheless, we have people like Josh Rogin, ingrates, who are pushing for war on both fronts at the same time. And you guys should all know who he is and what he's doing, and that's why I made this episode. So libertyweekly.net/228. And I know I had the mid-roll here, but if you want to help support my work, I'm having a live stream this Thursday night. It's the third Thursday of every month for premium subscribers at libertyweekly.club. People who are members of my membership club, libertyweekly.club. Go there, sign up for my newsletter. You can sign up for free, and then you can, on top of that, become a premium member. Free members get the free posts and previews of the paid subscription posts, and premium members get access to watch the live stream and other bonuses like early access to episodes and articles that I put out. So that's the one place to help support me, libertyweekly.club. And Mises Pieces, if you want Liberty Weekly merch, go to libertyweekly.net/merch. And Ludwig von Mises Pieces, he's the guy who does my graphic design, all the thumbnails and everything. He's great. He puts up with me and is very flexible, which really helps me out because I'm just like struggling to keep my head above water here with the podcast and my family and all the other commitments and my law practice, which is really heating up. So if I am a day or two late, or if I don't put out articles or posts as much as I'd like to be, I apologize. I'm working on that and trying my best. So again, libertyweekly.net/228. Thanks, guys. Peace.